for you.
Sure.
So, because there are a few things. First of all, a warm welcome to everybody joining us here today to our webinar, Hope is Not a Strategy, with Erich and with Peter. I'm honored to have you two here and have a great conversation about strategic planning. So first of all, thank you for taking the time. And second of all, thank you to all of the attendees joining us today, listening in, tuning in. I have a few things before we get started. So by default, you're all dialed in via your computer phone. If you prefer to have it on your phone, just click on the audio panel of the GoToWebinar facilitation, and you can easily switch to via telephone. Also, you have the opportunity to submit questions during the next 30 minutes. These questions will be collected and we will address them in our Q&A session at the end. So there's also a function in the GoToWebinar panel where you can just submit questions and we will screen those questions accordingly. Also, after the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with a short PowerPoint with more content, and you can also expect a blog post with even more content on what was talked about today. So today, just lean back and listen to the conversation we're going to have, and in the next days, you'll receive a follow-up and you can dive deeper into the contents of this webinar. So my name is Anne. I'm located here in Munich, so I'm European time. Good afternoon to all the ones joining from Europe or from Germany or from anywhere else in this time zone. I'm engagement manager at Vivaldi, and I would like to introduce you now to our speaker, Dr. Peter Evans. Dr. Peter Evans, thank you very much for joining us here today. So you're a managing partner at the Platform Strategy Institute. You have many years of experience in strategic planning. Only to mention one of your positions, which is the Director of Global Strategy and Analytics you had at GE for more than 6 years, and also holding a PhD from MIT. So thanks for joining us here today. Next to him, well, at least from my point of view here, to the left-hand side, Erich. Erich Joachimsthaler, CEO of Vivaldi, a business transformation firm, and my boss, actually. Erich founded this company more than 20 years ago, and since then he has helped many brands, consumer brands, B2B brands, evolve in the market setting. So I'm also very happy to welcome you here today.
Thank you.
Yes. So I also said questions, please ask them at any time. And I'd say we jump right into the topic while we are all here. And I will just give you a short overview in this presentation, what we're talking about here today. We have the brief introduction. We will talk about key challenges, approaches to strategic planning, and recommendations, and we will have the short Q&A. I already introduced us, so let's just jump right into key challenges. So, Peter, you have had many years in strategic planning. You have many years of experience. So let me ask you the question, what did you learn and what is your experience in strategic planning? And also, how do you see the role of strategic planning evolve here?
Sure. Thanks very much. It's great to be here with you all today. Thanks for tuning in. I started, I guess, in 2000, so it's almost been 2 decades, and I had the opportunity to see strategic planning from a couple different vantage points. One was working for a consulting firm, and so consultants obviously get involved in helping companies, so that's one perspective. The other is strategic planning at a Fortune 500. You mentioned the role that I had at General Electric, and that is a huge undertaking. You can imagine for a firm at that time, revenue was 150 billion and it had 300,000 employees, multiple line divisions all over the world. So the strategic planning process was a huge undertaking for the organization. I also had an opportunity to see strategic planning from the perspective of a partnership. So I worked for KPMG, and totally different structure and different planning process as a result. And then finally, I was on the board of the National Association for Business Economics, and associations also play a role in strategic planning, both in putting on content, gathering people together, in this case, applied economists. So looking at strategic planning from a variety of vantage points.
So Peter, you just discussed strategic planning as it was. So how does it look like now with the new situation we are in? Because things changed, I guess we all realize that. So what effect does that have on strategic planning?
Well, we're in the midst of a very dramatic, disruption to the market, to say the least. In a lot of planning, you have these techniques like SWOT analysis and things. And I think in this situation, you had to sort of throw that out. And the framework that I developed over the years is it got 4 components. One is you do need to look at the mega trends, so long-term trends. The other is shocks, right? And how shocks can affect the market. The third are constraints, and they can be talent constraints, it could be information constraints, it can be demand constraints, and it can be regulatory constraints. And the other are enablers. And enablers can come in the form of new technology, can come in the form of new intelligence, new insights. So it's megatrends, shocks, constraints, and enablers. And so thinking about the planning process, and today we now have not only an economic crisis, we have a health crisis, and we have emerging social crisis all together at one time, which is, really challenges in many cases fundamental assumptions that I think that people had just last year as to how the world was going to unfold. So we have to revisit those and systematically reevaluate where we stand and where the world is going.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think especially the point with the threefold crisis that you mentioned and what implications this has now for strategic planning. So Erich, I would like to ask you here. So what is your perspective on the situation that Peter just talked about the changes, about the crisis? Can you comment on this?
So I think that model, that mega trends, shocks, constraints, and enablers is a really good model. I think it's an enduring model of planning. I really like that. But I think my problem is that we make all those judgments about each of those 4 components based on past assumptions, because that's what we lived with. It's almost like lagging assumptions rather than leading assumptions. And I think that's the significant shift that we need to achieve in planning. Not going forward, but I think in this period of time because of the particular situation that we are facing right now.
Right. Now, what's really interesting is that companies have certain assumptions about how the world is unfolding, and therefore they direct their teams to go collect information about those issues. So very few companies right now have a whole lot of expertise in epidemiology or pandemic virology and the modeling around it. But what we're going to see over the next year is that there is no vaccine, right? And so the question is where are there going to be hot spots? So very few companies have that expertise in-house, but it's going to have an impact about how you think about which markets are going to be open and where their demand is going to be and where there's going to be really significant challenges. And so that it forces companies to think about collecting new information and actually also tapping into different talent than they may have thought was necessary.
That's exactly my point. That's exactly my point, Peter, because what happens is that if you look at the past assumptions, those are very concrete, very specific data, that very almost tangible data or information that you can collect. And the team that collects the data for the planning process is actually more comfortable with those factual data. But if you do the planning now properly, you need to look at very different data sets. A lot more data sets that you are not as comfortable being from GE. In fact,
So there's another risk, of course, is there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty as to what's going to happen. And one particular risk is that you spend too much time analyzing, right? And so then you get into this issue of kind of analysis paralysis. And I've heard, talking to some of my colleagues that are still working in big companies doing strategic planning, is that they're finding that there's tremendous demand to know what's going to happen, so the executives know which bets to place, but there isn't sufficient information, so they're ending up in this cycle of this loop of, oh, we have to gather more information in order to make a decision, and oh, there's too much uncertainty, and so they don't make a decision. And so there is a big risk of trying to analyze a situation where there's too much uncertainty.
Yeah.
So I would like to take this point also of uncertainty and wrapping up the introduction of what are key challenges to strategic planning. Lagging assumptions, megatrends disruptions. You have to stress different parts of the organization now. It's about people diversity. There's a time limiting factor. And I want to take this chance to ask our audience here. We have prepared a little poll, how they feel about their strategic planning at the moment. So let me just launch this poll real quick now. And we would love our attendees to vote, please, on our poll on how are you feeling about your strategic planning right now. I'm confident with no changes. My plan needs some changes, and my plans need an overhaul. So click now.
Is there a right or wrong answer?
Because that's a question that you have to answer later.
He gets points for certain answers.
So I can already see here coming up the results. I'll wait another 10 seconds because after that we will jump right into approaches to strategic planning, into the second part. So closing this poll in 3, 2, 1, and it's closed. I would like to share the results with you now. And there you go. So actually, we can see that this really is a very hot topic at the moment. Only 2% are confident with no changes, 64% think that their plans need some changes, and 34% say that the plans need an overhaul even. So this is where I would like to continue to the second part of our discussion here, and to approaches to planning. And I would like to ask either one of you, looking at these challenges that evolved and that you were just explaining to us, who are now people involved in strategic planning, and also where are changes to compare to what happened in the past? So how does the approach need to change in order to be successful for the future?
Yeah, I think there's really 4 areas
that you were just explaining to us. Who are now people involved in strategic planning, and also where are changes to compare to what happened in the past? So how does
Yeah, so I think there's really four areas that require relooking. As the poll indicated, people need to rethink their strategic planning process. One is around data and what data is necessary to insert in the process. The other are the methodologies. You know, do you want to shift from forecasting to more scenario planning, for example? The other is the people. You know, do you have the right team and talent involved in the process, or do you need to pull in others? And then finally is the process itself. And I think this deserves some attention given the fact that we're in a situation where we actually can't meet. And meetings are how a lot of strategic planning happens. And if you can't meet face to face, the whole process needs to be thought through, because it's very challenging to assemble all that information and have the really deep, you know, conversations and then sometimes battles that take place around really critical decisions, because the strategic planning process really sets up the vision for where the goals and targets are for the future, but also the budget process. And the budget process decides who's going to get resources and who's not going to get resources. And so the actual process for thinking about that in this Zoom world is quite critical. Do you agree, Erich?
Yeah, well, I think that I agree with that. There is a lot of that negotiation that takes place that's not part of a video conference. And I think we have here 8 offices, and I think that we have meetings in every one of the offices, but or conference rooms. But what really happens is when I'm walking out of that, and when I'm going from one conference room to another conference room, and we have a conversation, I think that's a real important sort of a part of the process, especially with this uncertainty, in place, where you don't rely on prediction as much, where you need to rely on some if you will say, call it scenarios or call it some estimation or sort of gut feeling. Yeah.
Right. Well, and also I think that the executive teams need to realize that resources need to be deployed to help with the extra friction that's involved this year in putting together the strategic plan, and that the teams responsible for supporting that process need additional help to make sure that it's as smooth as possible, that just the logistics of getting people online to have these discussions, they get the support of the top, because the more, what would you call it, line level people responsible, if they have to spend weeks trying to get people online for critical meetings or to supply the information they need, it's going to slow down the whole process, which is going to be really difficult for putting together a strong plan for next year.
Yeah.
Also, when you both stress the people factor, that is a very important one to consider in the strategic planning. Also, are there new parts of an organization that might need to be involved in strategic planning in the future that haven't been considered yet that much? Is that also something that needs to change in the approach of strategic planning?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Obviously, a good strategic plan taps all parts of the organization, both business lines as well as functions. But what's interesting this year is that the shock of COVID has stressed the environment in such a way that parts of the organization that may not have been as prominent in the strategic plan now need to get more attention. Obviously, supply chain is one, but as this social disruption unfolds, the folks that have been involved in CSR or diversity and things of that nature, it may need to have a more prominent place in terms of the planning process than they have in the past. Also, there's always the need to have independent analysis. The line leaders are put in place to be advocates for their product, and some of them are very good at advocating, but they also are quite good at cherry picking the future, and they pick the future that benefits their product or service. And the executive teams need independent analysis to be able to check that. So it's quite critical to have independent analyses either done internally in your organization or you bring in external parties. Now, I think a lot of organizations that want to get ahead of this, they have to realize that the folks that have expertise, for example, in health and whatnot, are going to be in high demand. So they only have so much time in the day to help companies think through some of these issues. So the companies that get out ahead and build relationships with those individuals or organizations or even academic institutions need to get ahead of that fast, because locking up that talent will give you an advantage.
Peter, what I actually think what the whole process or the approach, before you decide what approach you use, you need to almost assess what part of the business you do the planning for, or what business you are, because we have clients, like they have a retail business and they have a B2B side business. The B2B side, the retail business is like going from 100% to 30%. So that, right. And we have no clue of where the future lies. Then we have another business, another client that literally is taking off like exponentially. So there's the growth in technology and things. So I think there needs to be almost sort of a a recognition of, for the company, what environment am I going to face?
Another way to frame that is you know, in last year and the year before,
Yeah.
you might have set targets for certain parts of the organization in terms of sales and or new product delivery or certain pipeline from your innovation group. This year, it's all about pivoting and finding new sources of demand. And so the goals and objectives, and this is part of revisiting your strategic planning process, is setting in place the right goals and targets. And I think given the level of uncertainty, you're going to get a lot of pushback. And one risk in the planning processes is that a lot of line leaders, product P&L leaders, are going to come with very underwhelming targets because, you know, they don't want to be on the line to meet something that they're uncertain about meeting. So you may want to think about new goals and objectives, and one you may want to reward is the ability to pivot and find new sources of demand rather than, you know, traditional sales targets and things of that nature.
Is it possible? I mean, my question then to you, Peter, is it possible that then planning is actually not this, it doesn't have the same usefulness anymore in this world because
Not
if you
at all. I actually think the rigor, if you do it well, you have to think through the consequences. And it's good strategic planning is not first order analysis. It's second and third and fourth order analysis. The first order analysis almost anybody can get, right? They know the consequence of A is B. But it's when you get these multi-chain analysis, when one impact it has another and has another and has another, a good strategic planning process should reveal these multiple chains that are involved, and they can become quite challenging in your day job to think those through. That's why you need either an independent team inside the organization that does that. The other is connecting dots. You know, these big organizations, one side of the company doesn't know what the other side of the company is doing. And so the good strategic planning should reveal that, and also should show the executive team the real tensions that are involved in the trade-offs, right? If you do this, this is the consequence. If you do that, is the other. And the third is contingency planning, so that you do have a plan B. And often you spend a tremendous amount. I'm a fan of scenario planning, but what I found is executive teams don't like scenario planning. They want to know where to go. They're operational folks. They like targets that they can manage too. They don't like uncertainty. However, and you may not want to present, you know, a bunch of scenarios to executive team, but the strategic planning team should think those through, because if things don't go forward, that brings us to a fourth thing, and we're getting close to our time, which is the critical importance of signposting right now.
Yes.
Which is, where are we going? If we go down this path, what are the signs that suggest that we're on target, or if we see signs that we're moving from that? And so the strategic planning team really needs to be in charge of mapping those signposts, monitoring them carefully, and alerting the executive teams when they see things changing, so that those pivots can happen.
My point is that the signposts need to be built by leading indicators, if you will, and really the right ones. You know, those companies that can rely on what I call first-party data directly from consumers, I think are much more benefiting than those that rely on what we call third-party data or sort of like the typical analytical data that is available. I think that,
so you raise a really important point, which is, okay, you need to collect new data. So what data is valuable? And right now, a lot of the traditional inputs to strategic planning are inadequate, right? And so probably getting as close to the customer and where demand is going to be quite critical. Yes. So companies that have closer access to that information are probably going to be an added advantage.
You know, it's interesting talking about that. There's this company I know, Klöckner, I talk about it in my book. They have built a marketplace, sort of inviting other metal distributors to be part of that. They actually benefit because they get market information, not only their own information, but very solid information from the marketplace, just like Amazon benefits from what third-party sellers sell. So
well,
I think
what's interesting is that there are multiple marketplaces now emerging. They're not only B2C, as you mentioned, like Amazon or Alibaba, but also B2B. Shell just announced one. Toyota has a marketplace. A lot of the B2B industrial players recognize that. And part of it is access to high quality, real-time information.
Yes.
So I understand that data is key to future success of planning, also considering alternative data sources, which brings me to the last part also of our webinar here, recommendations of planning. I think you already touched a lot of important points here on what needs to be considered. So what actually, and I heard one in the last 2 minutes that you were talking very, very loudly, data. So what do you need and what can you rely on in the future for strategic planning when you have to make a recommendation now to our audience here? Most of them need to reconsider their strategic planning. So what are recommendations from your point? What to do now, what to consider, where to start, and how to do it?
So I think the first is to start immediately or to restart the process, because you know, a lot of companies start their strategic planning in November, December. They formulate, you know, early gathering of information in January, February, and then they present their strategic plans in May, June time frame. But all of those assumptions that were built in that time frame probably need to be revisited. And so I guess one recommendation is to have a mini review of the plan, or to accelerate the plan. A big challenge also is the time horizon. I worry a little bit about companies who just want to do 6 months to 1 year planning, because that longer term view is important. And so don't just think about the next 6 months, you know, also think about where the world is going to land. And then finally, you know, left field issues that you may not have considered need to be incorporated into the planning process, right? So as I mentioned, healthcare data is not something that a lot of firms have spent a lot of time on, but we're going to face a situation where we're going to have rolling hotspots around the world, and thinking through what are the implications of that for your supply chain, for your people, where they are, stores opening or not, or maybe reclosing in some instances. So there would be some examples.
I think that what's important is that in the normal planning is about what is my forecast or my plan relative to another company's plan or the industry. But right now, the industry, what is the industry? Is a car company like BMW or Mercedes really in the automobile industry, or are they in the mobility industry? So I think you need to look at planning more from an ecosystem, or what I call in the action field perspective, and look at what are the relevant sort of like participants in my value creation pool, if you will, and then draw on those in order to create a reliable forecast. And I think, Peter, what you said is really important. You start that now, you can build a model that is much more encompassing, that you needed to have, that will work for you in November or something, or in later on this year, that you didn't need before. But right now, I think it is looking at those ecosystem partners or participants in an interaction field that allows you to really, you know, zoom in and triangulate.
Right.
Your
well, you're hitting a sweet spot of mine, which is platform strategy.
Yeah.
I got exposed to platform strategy 10 years ago or so, and it's changed my worldview. And I think platform perspective can be very valuable in thinking through how to create competitive advantage today. So, yeah. Hey, thanks for the conversation. I really enjoyed. I appreciate you inviting me here today.
Great, thank you so much for your very valuable insights on strategic planning. We did receive a lot of questions, and we'll have another 10 minutes to answer
those
questions.
For Peter.
So I will just post the questions, and you have to decide who answers the question. So first question is, What is your take on the current trend to integrate design thinking with strategy? Do you think it's more of a fad or a genuine way to avoid the pitfalls of strategic planning?
I actually, may I just say, my point of view is Peter earlier mentioned about the kind of people that are participating in strategic planning. And I think that the design thinking perspective is or methodology provides a useful sort of a departure point, a useful add-on. But
yeah, but I worry a little bit because design thinking really works really well when you're in a workshop and you're together in a room where you can really have a rich conversation. I think there's a lot of innovation that has to take place around design thinking to make it work for a world of, you know, Zoom calls.
No, in a world of planning, because people like you who are in the planning world typically are not design thinking trained, you know. So they are more analytical, more forecasting, more business from the business side than from a design.
Well, I'm just thinking design thinking really works well when you crash ideas together and you have that dialogue together in workshop environment. You have a strong facilitator. I just, you know, I'm a little bit worried about how that process translates to a world in which we have to be very fast in coming up with a consensus around key parties in the organization. And so if you can do maybe super fast design thinking, you know, how do you accelerate the design thinking process? Maybe something you need to think about.
I think it's at that network level, at that ecosystem level versus a product design thinking. You know, so like I think that I know the challenges from a video point of view, but I think it's at the systems level. I think the systems level is a very good perspective to have.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. Second question. How much do you see digitization impact getting us through these crises? And if so, how are firms gearing up to use digitization for post-COVID-19 world?
Well, I think everybody recognizes now that there was a view of digitization that was happening, and we've just accelerated that by 3 to 5 years. You know, it's just speeded. The companies that had invested and were well set up were able to pivot. So digitization supported and facilitated that pivoting capability. And so, you know, we're really moving into a hybrid world where physical assets are still very important, but digital assets are so. The key, though, is that digital performs differently. The underlying economics, the underlying organizational issues associated with digital are different, and therefore that's what's really critical. And we could have a whole nother conversation about how they're difficult, but they really involve these intangible assets that are very difficult from your tangible physical assets. And understanding that well can put you at an advantage. If you don't understand it well, you can spend a lot of money on digital and not get the results you're looking for.
Maybe we should have another conversation on this in another webinar, so we'll keep that in mind. Thank you. Another question is, isn't it the best way to predict the future to create it? It is a vision issue which people are confused and stalled.
Yeah, well, that's great, but there are many things that are not under the control of a company. You know, one that we're going to see is policy issues. Many, and this is something that strategic, as I mentioned, left field things you may not have thought about before. Companies are used to receiving certain level of services from governments, right? That's where the taxes go. We are going to face massive budget constraints by governments in the next 2-3 years. So the services that companies relied upon, R&D, you know, all sorts of things, regulatory data actually governments provide, are going to be under severe constraints. And so understanding that landscape going forward, I think is very critical to having a thoughtful and realistic strategic plan.
Yeah, but I also think, you know, my point of view is, you know, yes, you create the future, but if you, I have a lot of fear as I run this company here. There's a lot of fear of suggesting to every employee is, hey, we are plowing in this new direction, we are investing in this new thing. this is very, in this day and age, there is so much scrutiny, so much, everybody is nervous. How are we spending the money? How do we invest? Why investing in this? Why are we not investing in what we already have? And so there's a lot of pressure it's hard, it's so much harder to say, I'm creating that future now, you know, where we are sort of like, we are all operating in sort of significant constraints.
Great, thank you. Another question, I'm looking at the time, we still have time for 2 or 3 questions. Do you have suggestions for adapting scenario planning to leverage data for more accurate future assumptions? I would like suggestions on new methods.
Yeah, I mean, scenario planning's been around for 3 decades. And so there's actually a rich knowledge base that's built up around it. I guess big questions are, how many scenarios do you want? Some go with 4, others go with 3, and some just go with 2. So you have to make these kind of big strategic questions. The problem when you do more is that the contingencies of what they mean, it gets very complicated. And so I worry a little bit about doing too many this year, because you want to provide realistic alternatives. The other is do you have the internal expertise to really build out those scenarios and get people to think about system structure change, not just alternative, you know, sensitivity analysis around a base case?
I find that there's my question on ecosystem, sort of looking at the larger ecosystem for the data. A good example is an automotive company I worked with. The automotive company has done all the planning based on dealer data. How many dealers, what is the ordering from the dealer side? Then in the electric side of the business, they actually went direct, you know, because Tesla went direct, everybody else went direct. They went direct, and the client told me, I have never had this kind of data. I never had first-party data from actual consumers. We only relied on basically the intermediary, the dealership, in order to get our data. So enriching those data, these new data sources, and in this case, with first-party data from actual consumers, you learn a hell lot, in my opinion.
Well, we still have to think through core assumptions. You know, there was an assumption that globalization was just going to continue to deepen, and that has been challenged dramatically. Another is around urbanization. There was a deep-seated a set of assumptions that cities were just going to continue to be magnets, and now, you know, the city centers are struggling. And so you know, some of these really fundamental core assumptions have been challenged, and scenarios allow you to explore the implications. The other one I find really interesting is this idea of cosmopolitan versus social cocooning. Are we moving to, oh, COVID's, you know, we come with a vaccine, are we going to just go back and embrace a global and interaction? Or are people going to feel more like getting just to their small groups? And which products do you know, are going to win in those different worlds?
Yeah.
Because one question was also, and I think you already addressed that, can you say more about scenario planning beyond financial sensitivities? Yeah. So the data you just mentioned goes far beyond only financial data. Am I right here?
Well, I mean, good economic forecasting should be built on a deep understanding of social issues, demographics, and regulatory issues. The challenge is that economists don't necessarily have all those capabilities. So you have to make sure that the economic models that you turn to, because basically, you know, if you're in a product, you just want the forecast so that you can plan your product, right? And you don't want to spend a whole lot but this year you really need to test and ensure that, hey, you know, what assumptions went into those? Really ask that question, because the senior executives, if they're any good, are going to demand to know what is the level of uncertainty around this plan and what assumptions went into them, right? Both political, regulatory, and social economic.
So maybe the solution is, you know, when you think of data in this planning process, how do, number one, you know, to your 4-part model, how do they affect the mega trends? How do they challenge the assumptions of the mega trends? How about the shocks? You know, what do we anticipate? What is the impact of shocks? What are the impacts on the constraints and on the enablers? So I think that's a good model
So you can think of COVID almost like an earthquake, and there's going to be aftershocks. And one of them I just mentioned, which is massive government budgetary constraints. So
Yes.
that I would consider an aftershock. That's that second and third order consequence of the initial shock. So thinking that through and what does it mean for your strategic plan, I think is time well spent for an organization.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe I'll take this as a chance to ask one last question around the threefold crisis you also just mentioned. So, do you see an emerging discussion in businesses redefining their shared value and the role it has to play serving the common good?
I may talk about this if I may just say my quick thing, my quick plug, because I wrote this book that's coming out in September on shared value versus shareholder value. So whoever gave me that question, thank you. I believe that's really the question on planning, because we are such a connected, hyper connected environment. In order to really understand, in order to go through the model, megatrends, shocks, constraints, and enablers, you really need to think of this as not as me, my company, my market share relative to somebody else's market share. That may be an economic model that is simple enough to do some forecasting, but that's not how the world works. It's much more an interaction field, much more connected. And I think that's what we need to figure out. That's how the planning process has.
I would answer it from the standpoint of new insights that are emerging around platform business models that recognize that you're creating value outside the boundaries of the firm. And what you want to do is you create positive network effects so that more value is created outside the boundaries, which creates more opportunity for you to capture, right? Those ways. So they call this the inverted firm. So we're moving to more of an inverted firm model in which you help encourage. So one example I think I like a lot is a Spanish bank called BBVA. They have a ecosystem open banking strategy. They're actually helping small, medium-sized enterprises launch e-commerce platforms. Why? Well, they provide loans to those small, medium-sized enterprises. They want those companies to be successful. So sharing their platform with those small and medium enterprises creates value for those companies, but also creates value back for that bank. So that's just one of many, many, many examples. You can use the word shared values. You can also just call it smart business in a platform digital world.
Actually, creating shared value is smart business as we go forward.
Yes, yes.
So Erich, on your behalf, I would like to thank then Mr. Schwaninger for posing this question. So thank you very much. And I guess this is also a great end note for our webinar here today. Erich and Peter, I would like to thank you very much for your time. I'm very sorry that we do not have the time addressing all of the questions asked, but we can see here from your reactions that it really is a topic everyone is certainly very interested about. So we will discuss also on how we can now extend the series of the webinar so that Erich and Peter can share more of the valuable insights they have in strategic planning and also share value. And we will let you know then. And for now, I would like to say thank you, Erich. Thank you, Peter. Thank you to everyone who listened in today, who had these excellent questions. You can expect a follow-up from us, some more content, and please feel free to reach out to us at hello@vivaldigroup.com if you feel like you want to talk about the question that we haven't answered it yet, so please do so. And Erich and Peter, if you want to say something.
Thank you.
Thank you,
guys.
See you again.
Stage is yours. Thank you.
Thanks for joining.